All right, let's get ready to explore something pretty fascinating today.
Sounds intriguing. What are we diving into?
Well, we're going deep on public international law.
Ooh, now that's a topic with some serious global implications.
Right. But don't worry, no law degree needed for this deep dive.
I was going to say, I left my legal textbooks at home.
Perfect, because we're going to break it all down in a way that anyone can understand.
Love that approach. So, no intimidating jargon, just a clear picture of how this whole international law thing actually works.
Exactly. Think of it like uncovering the secret code that countries use to get along, or sometimes not get along.
Uh-huh. Yeah, the global stage can be a bit of a drama sometimes.
It really can. But the thing is, it impacts stuff we actually care about, things like the environment, trade, even our human rights.
Those are some pretty big deals for sure.
And trust me, some of the examples we're going to unpack are truly wild. Did you know that individuals can sometimes be held accountable under international law?
Wait, seriously, not just entire countries.
Yep, individuals. We'll get into the nitty-gritty later.
Color me intrigued. Okay, so public international law, it's basically the rule book for how countries interact, right?
Exactly. It's like the instruction manual for the global playground.
Except the stakes are a bit higher than who gets the swing set.
Definitely higher. So, where did these rules actually come from? Is there some kind of international congress writing global laws?
Haha, I wish it were that simple. It's actually a bit more, intricate.
Intricate is a good word for it.
There are three main sources of international law: treaties, customary international law, and general principles of law.
Okay, so treaties, those are basically like contracts between countries, right?
Bingo.
Big, fancy documents with lots of signatures. I'm picturing a very long table and lots of pens.
You got it. Imagine two nations shaking hands on a deal.
But instead of a handshake,
It's a thick document full of legal jargon.
of course. And the deal could be anything from like trade agreements to environmental protocols to,
Even treaties about how to make treaties.
wait, hold on. Treaties about treaties.
Oh, absolutely. In fact, the Vienna Convention on the Law of Treaties.
Say that 5 times fast.
Haha, right. Well, it essentially lays out the ground rules for how to create, interpret, and even end treaties.
So it's like a meta treaty. A treaty about treaties.
Precisely. It makes sure everyone's on the same page when it comes to international agreements.
That's actually pretty clever. Like a fail-safe built into the system. But what about this customary international law you mentioned?
Ah, yes. Customary international law.
Does that mean countries just do whatever they've always done and it magically becomes law?
Well, it's not magic, but it is a bit like unwritten rules becoming official.
Okay, how does that even work?
Imagine a group of friends who always meet at a specific cafe on Fridays.
Okay, I could picture that.
No one ever said it was a rule, but after years of doing it, it becomes an unspoken expectation, right?
Right, like an unspoken agreement.
Customary international law is similar. It's about consistent practices and a general acceptance that those practices are, in fact, legally binding.
Interesting. So it's not just about what countries do, but also what they believe they have to do.
You got it. It's like a legal detective game where you have to figure out the motivations and legal justifications behind a country's actions.
Okay, so we've got our rule book, even if some of the pages are invisible. What are the big ideas holding this whole system together? I'm ready for some international law philosophy now.
Love it. Well, one of the most fundamental principles is the idea of sovereign equality.
Sovereign equality. Does that mean every country, no matter its size or power, gets an equal voice in the international arena?
You nailed it. Every country gets an equal vote, even if geographically some could fit inside others with room to spare.
So it's kind of like the United Nations General Assembly, where every country gets a vote.
Precisely. Think of it as a giant town hall meeting where everyone has the right to speak up, even if they don't always get their way.
I like that. What other principles are at play here?
Another crucial one is non-intervention. Basically, countries can't just meddle in each other's domestic affairs.
So no unsolicited advice on how to run a country.
Not exactly, no. Imagine if your neighbor kept barging in and telling you how to rearrange your furniture.
Yeah, that would get old fast.
That's essentially what non-intervention prevents on a global scale.
So mind your own business. But for countries, makes sense.
Mm.
But I'm sure countries aren't always the best at respecting each other's space.
Mm.
What happens when they, step on each other's toes?
That's where another key principle comes in: peaceful settlement of disputes. Countries are expected to resolve their conflicts through, well, peaceful means, diplomacy, negotiations, or even legal means.
So it's like taking an argument to a referee instead of, well, a fist fight.
Exactly. A stable and predictable world order requires clear rules and a way to resolve disagreements peacefully. That's also where principles like pacta sunt servanda come in.
Okay, now you're just showing off with the Latin.
Haha. It actually means agreements must be kept. It's pretty straightforward, but fundamental to international cooperation.
So keep your promises is a big deal in international law.
Huge. If countries couldn't rely on each other to honor their commitments, the whole system would crumble.
Makes sense. That's a pretty important principle in everyday life, too.
Absolutely. And of course, we can't forget about self-determination.
Right, the right of people to choose their own political destiny. Right.
Exactly. Self-determination affirms the right of people to freely choose their own political status and govern themselves, free from external domination.
So it's like the driving force behind all those historical movements for independence.
You got it. Of course, applying that principle can get complex in the real world, but it's incredibly powerful.
We've covered a lot of ground already.
Yeah.
It's clear that these principles are all about creating a stable and predictable world order.
They are, and believe it or not, it gets even more interesting from here.
More interesting. How is that even possible?
Because it's not just countries calling the shots in international law anymore. There's a whole cast of characters involved.
Ooh, I love a good plot twist. Who are these mystery guests on the international stage?
Well, you'll have to wait for part 2 to find out.
Okay, so last time we left off with a bit of a cliffhanger.
A whole cast of characters just waiting in the wings of international law.
Right. So who else is making waves on this global stage?
Well, for starters, we've got those heavy hitters international organizations.
You mean like the United Nations?
Exactly. The UN, the World Trade Organization, the International Monetary Fund. They're like the committees trying to keep the global party organized.
Okay, so teamwork on a global scale. Makes sense, I guess. Some problems are just way too big for any one country to tackle alone.
Precisely. These organizations deal with the massive, messy issues that cross borders.
So like peacekeeping. That's kind of the UN's claim to fame, right?
Yeah, the UN is famous for trying to prevent conflicts from escalating.
Right, those guys in the blue helmets. But what else do they do? I feel like I mostly hear about them when there's a war or a natural disaster.
Oh, they do way more than just put out fires on the international stage.
Okay, like what?
Well, they're also involved in promoting human rights, providing humanitarian aid, helping countries develop sustainably.
Wow, that's a pretty big to-do list.
It is. It's like they're juggling a million things at once, and all those things are super important.
So the UN, the ultimate multitasker.
Pretty much. And then you've got organizations like the World Trade Organization.
Right, the WTO. What's their main gig?
They're all about setting the rules for global trade. Think of them as the referees, making sure everyone is playing fair.
Preventing international trade wars.
Yeah.
Because I don't think anybody wants to see a tariff tantrum on the global stage.
Exactly. They help keep the global economy flowing smoothly. And of course, we can't forget the World Health Organization.
Right, the WHO. They've definitely been in the spotlight lately.
For good reason.
Yeah.
They focus on global health issues, pandemic response, disease prevention, access to health care. The list goes on.
So like the doctors of the international world.
You could say that, making sure everyone stays healthy and that the global party doesn't turn into, well, a super spreader event.
I like that analogy. It's amazing how many different organizations are out there, each with their own important role to play. But you mentioned that even individuals can get involved in international law. It still kind of blows my mind.
It's pretty wild, right? It's not just presidents and prime ministers calling the shots anymore. Remember when we talked about human rights being a cornerstone of international law?
Yeah, those basic rights and freedoms that every person deserves.
Well, individuals are at the heart of it.
So even though countries sign the treaties, it's really about protecting people.
Exactly. And here's the kicker. In some cases, individuals can even be held accountable for violating international law.
Wait, seriously?
Yep. Even if their own government is involved. We're talking about really serious stuff here. War crimes, crimes against humanity. Those are considered so serious that individuals can be held personally responsible.
Wow, so an individual could actually end up in international court.
It's possible. There are institutions like the International Criminal Court, or ICC, that can prosecute individuals for the most serious crimes.
So regardless of nationality, you could be held accountable for violating international law. That's pretty powerful stuff. What about NGOs? Where do they fit into all of this?
NGOs. They're like the activists of the international world, always pushing for positive change. They monitor human rights abuses, provide aid, and put pressure on governments and organizations to do the right thing.
They're like the conscience of the global community, always reminding everyone of their ethical obligations.
Exactly. We're talking about groups like Amnesty International, Doctors Without Borders. They're out there on the front lines fighting the good fight.
They do some seriously important work. But how much influence do they actually have?
More than you might think. They may not have armies or tons of money, but they've got something even more powerful: the power of persuasion and public opinion.
So they can mobilize people and put pressure on those in power.
They can. It's really inspiring to see how individuals working together through these NGOs can make a difference on a global scale.
It shows that even in a world dominated by powerful countries, everyday people can still have a voice.
Absolutely. Which brings us to an important question. What happens when a country decides to, well, ignore the rules? Are there actually consequences for bad behavior on the international stage?
That's a great question. We've talked about the rule book and the players, but does international law actually have any teeth?
Yeah.
Welcome back to the show. Last time, things got pretty real when we started talking about what happens when a country, doesn't exactly follow the rules of the international game.
Right. It's like that moment in a friendly game of basketball when someone throws an elbow suddenly, things get a little less friendly.
Exactly. So how does the international community handle those rule breakers?
Well, that's where the concept of state responsibility comes into play.
Okay, state responsibility. That sounds serious.
It is. It's basically the international legal version of you break it, you buy it. But in this case, the it could be a treaty, a human right, even a piece of the planet.
Wow. Okay, so what kind of actions could land a country in hot water?
Oh, all sorts of things. Violating a treaty, human rights abuses, causing environmental damage, even waging an illegal war. These are all big no-nos.
So there are real consequences for countries that break the rules. It's not just a slap on the wrist.
Definitely not. The consequences can range from having to pay compensation to facing economic sanctions, even military intervention in extreme cases.
I see. So it's not a perfect system, but at least there are mechanisms in place for accountability.
Exactly. It's about trying to create a system where actions have consequences, even on the international stage.
Are there any real-world examples of this state responsibility thing in action?
Oh, absolutely. Remember when we talked about the International Court of Justice? Back in the 1990s, they ruled that the U.S. had violated international law by supporting the Contras in Nicaragua.
Right, the ICJ, the big court for international disputes.
Exactly. And more recently, the International Criminal Court has issued arrest warrants for leaders accused of war crimes in places like Sudan and the Democratic Republic of Congo.
So it's not just talking towny. International law actually has some bite.
It does. It's about trying to create a system of justice that applies to everyone, regardless of their power or position.
Okay, so we've talked about these big principles of international law. But I'm curious to see how it all works in different areas. What are some of the big issues that the system tackles?
Well, one area that's always front and center is international human rights law.
Right, those basic rights and freedoms that every person deserves, no matter where they live.
Exactly. It's about setting a global standard for how countries should treat their citizens. Think of it as a global safety net for human dignity.
That's a great way to put it. But how does international law actually protect those rights?
Well, it works on multiple levels. Countries have a responsibility to protect the rights of their own citizens, but international law provides a universal benchmark, those fundamental rights that everyone deserves.
So it sets the bar high for how governments should treat their people.
Exactly. And there are key documents that spell out these rights in more detail. One of the big ones is the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, or UDHR.
The UDHR. I feel like I've heard of that.
It was adopted by the UN back in 1948, basically a blueprint for a just and equitable world.
What kind of rights does it cover?
It's a pretty comprehensive list, everything from the right to life and liberty to freedom of expression, religion, the right to education, healthcare, and protection from discrimination and torture.
Yeah, that's a lot to cover.
It is. It's like the ultimate human rights checklist.
But is it just a declaration, or are those rights actually legally binding?
Good question. The UDHR actually inspired a bunch of human rights treaties that turn those principles into enforceable legal obligations.
So it's not just words on paper, there are actual consequences for violating those rights.
Exactly. And remember the International Criminal Court we talked about? Well, they can step in and prosecute individuals for serious human rights violations, like genocide or crimes against humanity.
It's amazing to see how this all comes together. So we've got a system in place for protecting human rights. But what about in times of conflict? How does international law work in the context of war?
That's where international humanitarian law comes in, also known as the law of war.
The law of war. Sounds a little contradictory, doesn't it?
I know, right? But even in war, there have to be rules. Some things should just be off limits no matter what.
Makes sense. So what kind of rules are we talking about?
Well, things like the treatment of prisoners of war, the protection of civilians, the care of the sick and wounded, basically making sure that even in the chaos of conflict, basic standards of humanity are upheld.
Right. So even in the worst of situations, there's an attempt to maintain some level of order and protect those who aren't fighting.
Exactly. And one of the key sets of rules for doing that is the Geneva Conventions.
The Geneva Conventions, those are the ones I always hear about in war movies.
Those are the ones they were first adopted way back in 1864 and have been updated over time to keep pace with how warfare has changed.
So they're basically the international rule book for trying to keep things as humane as possible, even when things get really ugly.
You got it. They've saved countless lives in conflicts around the world, and violating the Geneva Conventions is a big deal. It's considered a war crime, and individuals can be held accountable.
So there are serious consequences for breaking those rules, even in the fog of war.
Absolutely. The international community takes these rules very seriously.
Okay, so international law isn't just about war and peace. It also covers how countries share resources, right?
Exactly. And one of the big areas there is the law of the sea.
The law of the sea, I'll admit that sounds a little obscure.
It might sound niche, but it's actually pretty crucial. The ocean is a vital source of food, energy, transportation, so you can imagine things could get messy if there weren't any rules for how countries use and share it.
Okay, I'm starting to see why the law of the sea might be important. What are some of the main rules governing this watery world?
Well, the most important treaty is the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, or UNCLOS. It was adopted in 1982 and has been ratified by over 160 countries.
So it's basically the ultimate rule book for how countries interact on, in, and under the sea.
Pretty much. It sets up a framework for managing things like territorial waters, exclusive economic zones, the continental shelf, all those maritime zones that determine who can do what where.
It's like zoning laws, but for the ocean.
Exactly. It helps prevent conflicts over things like fishing rights or who gets to drill for oil in a particular area.
Fascinating. So international law isn't just some abstract concept. It actually shapes how we interact with the world in all sorts of ways.
It really does, and it's constantly evolving to meet new challenges, from climate change to cybersecurity to the rise of artificial intelligence.
It sounds like international law is a pretty dynamic field. There's always something new to consider.
Absolutely. And with all these new challenges on the horizon, it's more important than ever to understand how this system works.
Well said. We've covered a lot of ground today, from the basic principles of international law to the key players to some really interesting areas where it all comes together.
It's been quite a journey.
It really has. And I think the biggest takeaway is that international law isn't just for lawyers and diplomats. It affects all of us. It changed how our world works, how our governments operate, and even how we think about our place in the global community.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
It's a reminder that we're all part of something bigger than ourselves, and that we have a shared responsibility to uphold these rules and principles that help keep our world a little less chaotic.
Absolutely. And with so many complex challenges ahead, understanding international law is more important than ever.
Well, on that note, we'll wrap up our deep dive into the fascinating, ever-evolving world of international law. Thanks for joining us.